Live from Abuja, Nigeria, this is Global Digest. I am Amma Marcus. Across Africa in 2025, millions of citizens went to the polls. Yet, the story behind the ballots was anything but uniform. In some countries, elections reflected genuine competition and the possibility of change. In others, they served to reinforce entrenched leaders or even legitimize former military rulers. From Gabon's coup to Ballot transition to Malawi's closely contested race, from Cameroon's enduring leadership to Tanzania and Ivory Coast dominance by incumbents and ruling parties, the continent experienced an unprecedented mix of outcomes. Today on Global Digest, we ask the pressing questions. Are elections in Africa still tools for democratic transformation, or have they increasingly become instruments to confirm existing power? What do these patterns tell us about governance, legitimacy, and Africa's place on the global stage in 2026? Well, joining me to unpack this is Dr. Titus Utibe Monday. He is a lecturer in political science and governance expert at Adeleke University. His research focuses on Nigerian government and politics, political theory, elections, conflict and development studies, with emphasis on governance, security and corruption. Well, he's joining us today to help us interpret what these elections reveal about power, institutions and the future of democracy on the continent. Hello, Dr. Titus. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, Amma.
All right, thank you for coming.
I trust you're doing well today.
I'm very well, thank you for asking.
That's nice meeting you.
So let's start. Let's look across the African region, 2025 elections. What patterns stood out for you in how power was contested or consolidated?
Yes, looking at the elections in Africa, a lighted-minded person would look at it. What has been the essence of election? If election, for instance, is about selecting a leader who would, take responsibility of governance and ensuring that the people have been, taken care of in terms of dividends of democracy. Because in the recent times, the third wave of democracy in Africa actually habitualizes the aspects of election, which is the bedrock of every, governance attempt. Indeed, without election, there is no country that will actually experience good leadership, good governance, as well as development prospects. However, in Africa, election has become a thing of serious concern by scholars, analysts, and practitioners. Elections in Africa is flooded with so many, instances where the leaders see it as an avenue to impose their power, struggle, and of course the aspect of weak institutions and many other, events culminated to make elections in Africa to look somewhat abstract and functional or dysfunctional. For instance, if election is conducted in Africa today, majority of the leaders sees elections as an opportunity to amass wealth at the detriment of the people. As a result of this, remedies and frameworks that have been, put in place to address the quest for good leadership had not really been, standing. For instance, when you looked at election as a means of electing a leader to ensure good governance, there should be aspect of credibility. In the recent times, elections in Africa are experiments more of crisis, more of opposition, protest on the social unrest, political instability, and even the military coup that is ongoing. So from my end here, I take into consideration of three dimensions of these instances of failure of elections in Africa, most especially the unprecedented elections that were conducted in Africa, about more than 10 countries where there was a great expectations. First, the post-colonial leadership in Africa, believe in a seat-tight syndrome, and this is one of the things that play out in Cameroon and, of course, in Malawi, even in several instances. The post-colonial leaders are into a power struggle where they also preferred to maintain their personal, gains against the masses. And as a result of this lack of trust, the masses, the voters in Africa do not really, trust the public institutions, the leaders, and of course, that gives room for a military takeover. Not really that the military is one of the, civilized institutions, in the recent time, as one of the best to adhere to the global need of a good citizenship and welfare, development. But as a result of instances of this seat-tight syndrome of leaders, and that is involved, enveloped with high level of corruption, favoritism and patronage politics over time, they seems to forget certain things.
Okay, so Dr. Titus, let's move over to one of the recent elections that took place in Africa a couple of months ago. Let's look at Gabon now, where Brice Oligui Nguema transitioned from leading a coup to winning the presidency through the election. Now, in your opinion, do you think this would set a precedent for other countries where military figures are involved in governance, taking into cognizance that in Guinea-Bissau, the Election Commission has confirmed that General Doumbouya won the election and he is now the president of Guinea?
To the best of my knowledge, that is not an aspect of governance, because he who actually came into power with barrel of gun would definitely operate in that direction. But look at the Gabon, for instance. The previous crisis, the previous governance challenges that was there, of course, the Bungos family and the attempts to stay in power for a very long period of time. And of course, Nguema actually came into power through the barrel of gun, because people will think that the election was conducted on a platform of democratic, arrangement, but that's not true. He actually overpowered and even molested, let me put it that way, or forced the citizens to accept his coming to power. So that has not, to the best of my knowledge, is not one of the doctrines or principles of a liberal democracy. I think although elections were conducted, election was done in that country, but then was it really the consent of the people? If it was the consent of people, what is the outcome? Because the Nguema's regime, leadership coming to that country also have a personal motive, a personal gain, that he would benefit from that country. So, taking up a coup is actually illiberal in nature, and it is democratic in nature. So he actually came into power, to me, to the best of my knowledge, through a coup on their platform of elections. But don't quickly forget this. Majority of African leaders in the 21st century actually operated on two platforms. The first platform is where they come in as a liberal Democrat, and the second one, they display a characterization of authoritarian regime by imposing a certain, law, a personal law into the states. And as a result of that, the shadow state elements who actually are waiting for way to erupt social protests and unrest would take that opportunity. So the guy came in, that actually came into power, to some, is illiberal. To me, it's actually illegality of a certain established law
Okay.
in that country.
All right, so let's move away from transition from military rule to democracy. Let's look at Malawi's situation now, where the election was genuinely competitive, and we saw President Lazarus Chakwera narrowly win Peter Mutharika amid the economic pressures. Well, what would you say this teaches us about the role of policy and economic performance and their role that they play in shaping electoral outcomes?
Yes, first, we have to take into consideration of the crisis of development in Africa, the crisis of development. And there is what we call stomach infrastructure in Nigerian colloquial or African colloquial. If the people are actually inflicted with certain pains and troubles, and of course, remember the country was in dilemma, Malawi, they faced with a lot of economic crisis, inflation, instability in terms of cost of living and the rest of others. And so if he narrowly escape, of course, we can always term that as one of democratic, elements in Africa in terms of Malawi's election, because that tight corner of winning election just attests that the people were not really satisfied with other, opposition parties. Candidates that also win for that election. Beyond that, democracy, as it's usually, put to the mindset of people, there's nothing wrong with democracy in Africa, but the practitioners, the operators of this system, actually, fall out. So the failure of a particular leader to, ensure adequate, governance prospects, good indicators in terms of economic growth, gross domestic, products, in terms of stability in the economy of the country. Definitely, it will determine who comes to power, who do not come. So actually, I believe that Lazarus, if he's very interesting to, if he's having a political will to transform Malawi, I think there should be an unprecedented, changes in that country.
Now, let's move now to our West African neighbor, Cameroon. Well, Paul Biya, who is now 92, secured yet another term despite low voter enthusiasm. Now, he is 92 and he has ruled Cameroon for such a long time, and that was because he changed the age limit, to run for presidency. Now, I have to ask, does the age itself become a political liability in today's African democratic system?
And of course, yes. There is no serious-minded citizen, practitioner or analyst that would say it's not a political liability. Because if you look at someone who has been in power, and I think this is the, to the best of my knowledge, is the eighth, consecutive tenure in that country, ranging of more than 40-something years. And this particular person is 100 years, or close to 100 years now. So how would he how would he implement certain things? And indeed, a particular, maxim that we used to justify the Cameroon leadership or the Cameroonian governance is the aspect of from rupture to continuity. The country is actually in shambles because, electing such an, a leader into that position again, it means that there is nothing Cameroon would definitely, write home when it comes to a prospect of development. But however, like I always mention, the Sitai syndrome of post-colonial leaders in Africa actually benefits in, some set of people. Even in Cameroon today, if you go back to Cameroon and find out the feelings of the masses, they will be jubilated because there are people who also benefiting from that kind of, addressed, crisis of governance in that country because, he had established a structure. Go back to the history of Libya during Gaddafi's reign. He has established a structure, a followers and institutions that would always do anything possible to favor him during another set of elections. Don't be surprised to see that if God keeps him alive after exhausting this tenure, he will go for it, or eventually he will be governing from his sick bed, and that's all for Cameroon, governance prospects.
Okay, so looking at all of these countries collectively, and we're seeing that in 2026, we're going to be having elections across African countries, including Algeria, Benin, Cameroon, Cabo Verde, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Gambia, Libya, Somalia, Uganda. A lot of African countries will be having elections today, this year. So now, my question I'm going to have to ask you is, looking at these countries collectively, what patterns do you expect to influence Africa's coming elections in 2026?
Yes, about 10 countries, like you just mentioned, is actually expecting to go into poll by 2026. To the best of my knowledge, the trends will not be different from what we have seen so far. To the best of my knowledge, as long as there is an institutional weaknesses, to the best of my knowledge, as long as there is political instability and, of course, the colonial legacy of the post-colonial states, state formation in Africa, there will be no much changes, except the institutional mechanisms needs to be readdressed. Of course, we have seen the influence of the youth's political participation. Of course, it doesn't really yield good, measures as it expected. We have seen an attempt for electoral management bodies to integrate, technologies, of the sophisticated technologies for casting of their votes and, of course, doing elections or electioneerings. But then the question is, these countries that you've mentioned, especially in Libya, we have seen the trends. Of course, Ethiopia may be better, and of course, the trends in Gambia has always been competitive. But to the best of my knowledge, it could, change. There could be a paradigm shift. It depends on the context and the institutional framework, set aside by different, institutions that are involved in the conduct of the election. But it actually sent a signal to majority of the African countries in the recent times. If you looked at the military intervention, military coup that is taking place in Africa, and then you go back to the Samuel Huntington theorization of professional military engagement in democratic arrangement. Yeah, and of course you look at the constitutions theory, theory of development, and that is one of the reasons that when there was an attempt for military coup in Mali, and of course several attempts in the Niger Republic, it also sent a signals to Nigeria, because these guys are interested to snowball and repeat the, a certain same status quo that has been maintained elsewhere. But let's look up to 2026 in African election. To me, as long as election is a litmus test for a credibility of leadership, if these countries are actually ready to implement certain rules and regulations that is governing electoral conduct, I believe it will be better than the 2025 conduct of elections in Africa.
Okay, so you mentioned the youth population growing, and of course these are the people who are locally leading change in this day and time, and of course social media is also shaping political debate. Well, I have to ask, are elections likely to regain their transformative power, looking at the youth push, not forgetting youth-led protests that have gone through the African continent in places like Kenya and other African regions that have experienced some sort of political shifts?
Yes, the youth participation, like I mentioned earlier, is actually a force. Although it depends on the context of the country, because, in Nigeria, we also tried the same in 2023 general elections, and the youth also, contributed immensely, although the system were crumbled by, lack of public trust as a result of one used or the other. Yes, if you look at the trends in Kenya, the youth also, participated and influenced electoral processes. So the youth is a strong force. But then, let's not forget about like I always mention, the authoritarian nature of these Democrats, authoritarian nature of these Democrats, some of them would always use, certain personal laws, not, the institutional laws, to influence the, voters' conduct and, of course, the voters' behavior during the elections. What if the youth participates voluntarily and raise the bar from increasing the, voting trends, and then subsequently the leader will now come and say, I don't agree with this. I would use all the paraphernalia of the state and of course other institutional mechanisms in terms of security agencies to threaten their life. And of course, this has been a dilemma of African elections over time. Of course, nobody can doubt about that. It has always been, especially when it comes to incumbency factor. The incumbency factor, they have all the political powers and of course the will and whatever that it takes for them to influence the conduct of elections. So the youth sometimes may be powerless when it comes to a final decision of the poll.
Okay, so let's look at regional interventions now. Let's look at the role ECOWAS and AU would play in these elective processes. So we understand ECOWAS, they do have election monitoring bodies that go through West African countries and ensure that, democracy is taking place as it should. Do you think ECOWAS and the AU are doing enough to make sure, looking at the history of elections in 2025 and being that Nigeria is looking to have elections soon, do you think ECOWAS and ECOWAS and AU rather, are doing enough to ensure that this is moving forward as it should?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, I will put it is this: it is subject to individual criticisms. The AU and of course the ECOWAS, to the best of my knowledge, they are toothless bulldogs. They are just back without biting, because we have several instances. Okay, for instance, why Burkina Faso, Mali, in the recent times, there were military incursion in their politics and in their system, and then they could not deter. Of course, looking at the role of ECOWAS in terms of one of their roles is election observation mission, mediation and diplomacy, promoting standards, post-election follow-up, joint mission, security and stability. Looking at all this role, which one have they really addressed, or which one have they really, carried out? The election observation, yes, it's always there, but do they really follow up to know the trends of conflict, erupting in different locations of election where elections are conducted? So sometimes their mandates, conflict with their interests, and of course, they are somewhat powerless to undo certain, challenges that is facing Africa today. And of course, the history of Africa, like I always mention, Africa was born in conflict, sustained in conflict, and continue to wallow up in conflict. This conflict sometimes is as a result of colonial legacies that was, in tandem with state formation, crisis in Africa, and of course that brings in the issue of identity crisis, identity, ethnicity politics, and of course patronage and many others. So ECOWAS, to the best of my knowledge, and of course they have come up with different, palliative, different dimensions, different interventions when it comes to mobilization of citizenship education, civil society orientations, and giving strict rules and sanctions. Okay, let's come down to our own direction here. Why, for instance, despite the sanctions that were given to Burkina Faso and Mali, and yet the military still continue to rule that country?
Well, ECOWAS...
Have they really addressed?
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Have they really addressed the issue? The sanctions sometimes, like I said, the international law actually stand to work in for some instances, and of course the regional law is really falling apart over time. Like recently, Nigeria sent their soldiers to go and quell situation, and the soldiers were captured. Military, Air Force were captured somewhere. and detain them. So where is the regional strength?
Oh, I think
Where
that
is the
situation
power?
happened. I think that situation happened when the aircraft was headed for maintenance, and they
Yes,
had to do an emergency landing in Burkina Faso. It wasn't really,
yes.
it
Now
wasn't more. It wasn't really a
it's
military intervention. It was more of a stop off,
no.
an emergency stop off. It wasn't from the statements we hear from the Nigerian government, the Ministry of Foreign
Uh,
Affairs, and also from Burkina Faso. We get to understand it was an unplanned stop where they were heading to Portugal, I think, and so they had to stop. And being that Burkina Faso was not pre-informed of
a flying
Nigerian
zone.
a flying zone, yes, so that's why our military forces had to be detained for a bit. But they've been released, and then they are back to
Yes, they've
Nigeria.
been released. What I am saying is that if ECOWAS actually have a strong force and the sanctions, so to speak, look at what they are saying. Sometimes these ones are just political solutions just to calm down situation of international politics and regional concerns, not to just, trigger many issues.
Okay.
An insider will tell you that, oh, look, it also, attempted to challenge the whether external or internal sovereignty of the Nigerian states.
Okay. Well, Dr.
Yes.
Titus, it's been lovely having you with this conversation, but let's continue. How do these electoral trends impact Africa's credibility and standing on the global stage?
Oh my goodness, it's to the best of my knowledge. If you look at the trends of elections that were conducted in Africa during the 2025, it's really right off the credibility of elections in Africa. Because if you look at the patterns and the trends of these conflicts, you will notice that it's on the high, level. And how do Africa, for instance, will compete with the global space when it comes to conduct of election? It has not really addresses the issue of credibility. Credibility has to do with competence of the leaders, and the leaders we are seeing today do not really have the capacity to translate, governance issues to, well-being of the citizens. So it's really indeed, if you go back to the Western ideology over Africa, you will notice that sometimes they write off, Africa when it comes to conduct of election. There has never been any serious election that, they have to applaud. There has been maybe just 99% of success. It has not been that way. It has always been the negative effect. So it really affects, credibility in international image among, African countries, of course.
Okay.
There are a lot of projections that it might be better in the subsequent season. But when you looked at the trend so far, it's really diminishing. And that is why we begin to ask a question of, democratic backsliding at the global stage, especially in Africa. And of course, we cannot just dispute that fact, because if you look at American democracy, it's also backslided. And of course, the role Trump played out in the recent times is not really acting as a Democrat or someone who is interested to instill, democratic dividends and of course pillars of democracy when it comes to, global, stage. So Africa, to the best of my knowledge, has lost that credibility because in the recent times we've seen a lot of crises and people lack trust. People have lost trust in public institutions such as the conduct of election. People don't trust issues of elections again in Africa.
Okay. Well, as Africa moves into 2026, the question remains, will elections regain their transformative power, or will legitimacy continue to be negotiated outside the ballot box? We thank Dr. Titus Utibe Monday for helping us navigate these complex realities, and we hope to have you soon on the program again.
Thank you so very much, Amma. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Well, this week on Global Digest, we will continue exploring post-election transitions, regional dynamics, and emerging flashbacks, and asking whether Africa has truly learned from one of its biggest election years yet. Well, still ahead on Global Digest, Venezuela's new leader, Rodriguez, is to be sworn in as China and Iran calls